In a small town surrounded by quiet streets and old brick buildings, there worked a woman everyone knew but no one really noticed. She came to the school every morning before the first bell rang, carrying a small lunch bag and a set of keys that jingled softly with every step. She moved quietly through the halls, mopping the floors, wiping the boards, and picking up things the students left behind. Her clothes were always neat but plain, and she spoke gently to everyone who greeted her. She wasn't one to talk much. Most people only knew her as the school's janitor, the kind woman who always smiled and helped when a classroom needed cleaning or when a student dropped their lunch tray. The teachers liked her because she never complained, even when asked to stay late after events. But no one really asked about her life. She was simply part of the background, like the sound of the morning bell or the smell of chalk dust every now and then. As she cleaned the music room, she would pause for a second and touch the piano keys softly, almost like greeting an old friend. It was only a quick moment, a few gentle notes, barely enough to be noticed, and then she would move on with her work. To anyone else it would seem like nothing, but for her, those few seconds meant everything. They were small reminders of something she had once loved deeply, something she had locked away for many years. One chilly morning, the school was busy preparing for a teachers' event that weekend. The music teachers were in the auditorium, rehearsing songs and discussing who would play which instrument. The janitor was nearby, stacking chairs and setting up stands for the performance. She kept her distance as usual, quietly doing her job while the teachers joked and laughed among themselves. "Hey, could someone help us move the piano closer to the center?" one of the teachers called out. The janitor looked up and nodded politely, walking over to help. Together they pushed the piano to the front of the stage. When they were done, one of the teachers, trying to make small talk, smiled at her and said, "You've got a good touch with that thing. Do you play?" The woman gave a shy smile and said softly, "A little. A long time ago." Her voice was so calm and modest that it almost disappeared in the noise of the hall. The teacher laughed lightly. "A little, huh? Maybe we should let you play something for us sometime," he said in a joking tone. The others chuckled and she simply smiled again before returning to her work. Later that day, the same group of teachers were talking about their students' upcoming piano recital. They were frustrated because some of the pieces were too difficult for their students to master on time. One teacher sighed and said, "It's that Liszt piece again. None of them can get the rhythm right. It's way too advanced." Another one laughed. "Maybe we should let our janitor friend try it. She said she plays a little." They all laughed together. It wasn't meant to be cruel, just casual teasing between adults. But what none of them realized was that the woman was still nearby, wiping the tables in the back of the room. She heard them but didn't react. She just kept cleaning, a faint smile on her face, though her eyes looked distant as if remembering something long forgotten. When the laughter faded, she glanced at the piano again. Her hand paused mid-wipe. For a brief second, the memory of her younger self flashed in her mind, sitting in a grand hall, fingers gliding across the keys, the sound of applause filling the air. But then she blinked and the memory was gone. That life was over now. She was someone else in another world. The next day she came to school early as always. The halls were still dark and empty. She unlocked the auditorium door and turned on the lights. The piano sat quietly in the middle of the stage. She looked at it for a long time, her keys dangling loosely from her hand. Then she walked up the steps and sat down on the bench. Her hands rested on her lap at first, trembling slightly. It had been so many years since she had truly played. The fear of forgetting, of sounding foolish, crept into her chest. But then she took a slow breath and her fingers found the keys. She pressed one softly, then another. The sound echoed through the empty hall, pure and clear. Slowly her hands began to move, hesitant at first, then more freely. The melody came back like a whisper from the past, growing stronger with each note. The janitor wasn't there anymore. It was the young woman she once was, the one who had played in concert halls, who had dreamed of performing for the world. The music flowed like a river, and for a few minutes she forgot everything else. She didn't notice that someone had walked into the back of the room. One of the teachers had come early that morning to pick up some music sheets. When he heard the piano, he froze at the door. The sound wasn't rough or clumsy. It was breathtaking. Every note carried emotion, precision, and grace. He stood there quietly, not wanting to interrupt. When the piece ended, the woman lifted her hands slowly from the keys and sighed as if waking from a dream. Then she noticed him standing there. "Oh, I didn't see you. she said quickly, embarrassed. The teacher looked amazed. That was incredible. You weren't joking when you said you could play? She smiled softly and shook her head. It's just an old habit. He laughed in disbelief. Old habit? That sounded like someone who's been performing for years. She didn't reply, just gave a gentle smile and started to collect her cleaning things. The teacher watched her go, still trying to process what he had heard. Later that day, during lunch, he told the other teachers what he had witnessed. She's not just a casual player, he said. She's the real deal. I heard her play this morning. Flawless technique, perfect touch. The others laughed again, thinking he was exaggerating. You're telling us the janitor is secretly a concert pianist? One said jokingly. I'm serious, he insisted. You have to hear her yourself. That afternoon, the teachers decided to call her over again while setting up for another rehearsal. She was cleaning nearby and one of them said, Hey, would you mind playing something for us? We heard you've got some hidden talent. She looked surprised and shook her head. Oh no, I just play for myself sometimes. I'm not good enough to… Come on, the teacher interrupted kindly. Just a few notes. We're curious now. The other teachers joined in, smiling, encouraging her to try. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but they were friendly and light-hearted about it. Just a short piece, one said. Think of it as helping us test the sound. She looked at the piano, then at them. Finally, she sighed and said, All right, just for a minute. She walked slowly to the piano and sat down. Her heart raced, not from fear of playing, but from the attention. She hadn't performed in front of anyone in years. She placed her fingers on the keys, paused for a second, and then began. The first few notes were soft and steady. The teacher stopped talking. The sound filled the room with something almost magical, so pure that it felt unreal. The melody rose and fell with grace, the rhythm flawless, the emotion deep. Within moments, the teachers were frozen in silence. It wasn't just skill they heard, it was soul. Every touch of the key spoke of joy, loss, and years of unspoken feelings. When she finished, there was no sound in the room, only the fading echo of the last note. The teachers looked at her in disbelief. She stood up quickly, a little embarrassed by their stares, and said quietly, I told you I just play a little. Then she picked up her mop and left the room. The teachers didn't know what to say. They stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. One of them finally whispered, That wasn't someone who plays a little. That was someone who's lived music. Outside the music room, the woman walked down the hall, her steps quiet. A faint smile crossed her face, not from pride, but from peace. For the first time in years, she had played freely again. The music that had once been her life had found its way back, if only for a few minutes. She didn't know that her secret wouldn't stay hidden for long. The moment those teachers heard her play, something in their hearts had changed. And soon the whole school would come to see her not as the janitor who cleaned the floors, but as the woman who could make a piano speak. The day after she played the piano in front of the teachers, something felt different in the air. When she entered the school, she noticed a few teachers smiling at her in a new way, not out of politeness, but out of genuine admiration. She didn't understand why at first until one of the teachers said with a grin, We're still thinking about your performance yesterday. That was something special. She smiled politely, a little shy, and said, I'm glad you liked it. It was just an old song. But deep inside, her heart was racing. It had been so long since anyone had listened to her play with such attention. She tried not to show how much it meant to her. But she felt a warmth in her chest that stayed with her the whole day. When she walked into the auditorium later that afternoon to clean up, she found a few teachers talking again about the recital. They were sitting by the piano, flipping through sheets of music. As soon as they saw her, one of them smiled and said, Ah, the pianist is here. Another said jokingly, We might have to hire you as our music coach. She shook her head quickly, embarrassed. Please don't say that. I'm just doing my job. One of the teachers leaned forward, curious. Where did you learn to play like that? That wasn't beginner stuff, she hesitated. She wasn't used to people asking her about her past. I used to play when I was young, she said softly. I studied for a few years, but life took me another way. They could sense she didn't want to say more, so they didn't push her. Still, their curiosity only grew stronger. They had seen people play well before, but there was something different about her. It wasn't just skill, it was the emotion behind every note. There was a story in her music, and they could all feel it. Over the next few days, small things began to change. Whenever she entered a classroom or walked through the hall, students and teachers seemed a little friendlier. greeting her more warmly. Word was spreading, though she didn't know it yet. The teacher who had first heard her play early that morning had told others in the staff room, and soon almost everyone in the school had heard about the mystery pianist. At first, she didn't notice the whispers. She went about her duties as usual, mopping the floors, cleaning the blackboards, arranging the chairs. But one day, while she was dusting the hallway outside the music room, she overheard a group of students talking. "Do you think it's true?" one said. "They said she played like a real performer," another replied. "My mom said the teachers were speechless," a third added. The woman paused for a moment, listening quietly. Then she smiled faintly to herself and kept cleaning. She didn't want attention, and she certainly didn't think of herself as anyone special. To her, it was just a moment that happened unexpectedly, a piece of her old life that had slipped out for a few minutes before returning to silence. But destiny, it seemed, had other plans. That Friday afternoon, as the teachers prepared again for their event, the same group gathered in the auditorium. One of them said, "You know, we still don't have anyone who can handle that list piece. It's too difficult for our students, and even I can't get it right in time." Another teacher chuckled. "Why don't we ask her? She probably knows it by heart." The others laughed, but it wasn't a mocking laugh anymore, it was a hopeful one. They had all seen her play. They knew she could do it. Just then she entered the room carrying her mop and bucket. They looked at each other, then at her. "Excuse me," one of them said kindly. "We were just talking about you." She blinked in surprise. "About me? I hope I didn't do anything wrong." No, he said quickly. "Quite the opposite. We were wondering if you'd help us. We need someone to play a difficult piano piece for our event next week. It's called Liebestraum, and honestly, it's giving us trouble. We thought maybe you could try." She froze for a moment. "Oh no," she said quietly, shaking her head. "That's far too advanced. I couldn't possibly." The teacher smiled knowingly. "You said the same thing before, and then you stunned us all. Come on, just try it once." She hesitated, looking down at her hands. The name of the piece struck something deep inside her. It was one she had played long ago, during a time when her dreams were still alive. She remembered the feel of the piano under her fingertips, the way the melody had made her heart swell. It was beautiful, but it also carried memories she had buried long ago. "I don't think I can," she said softly. "It's been too many years," another teacher said gently. "Just one try. You don't have to perform if you don't want to. We just want to hear how it sounds." She looked around the empty room. The piano sat quietly on the stage, bathed in the afternoon light. It seemed to be calling her again. Slowly, she put her mop aside and walked toward it. Her heart pounded as she sat down. "All right," she whispered. "Just for a minute." The teachers gathered around quietly. She took a slow breath, her hands hovering above the keys. Then, as if guided by memory alone, she began to play. The first notes floated softly through the air, gentle, hesitant, like footsteps on a frozen pond. But soon her confidence grew. Her fingers moved gracefully, dancing across the keys with precision and emotion. The melody filled the room with warmth and sorrow at once. Every rise and fall in the music told a story of love, loss, and the quiet strength of someone who had endured much and kept going. The teachers were completely silent. None of them even dared to breathe too loudly. They weren't watching a janitor anymore. They were watching an artist, someone who had lived a whole life inside music. The sound echoed through the room, and even the empty chairs seemed to listen. When the last note faded away, the woman stayed still for a moment. Her hands rested on the keys, and her eyes glistened softly. Then she stood up, looking almost embarrassed, and said, "I hope that's enough." It took a few seconds before anyone spoke. Then one teacher said in a hushed voice, "That was incredible." Another whispered, "Where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated, clearly not wanting to make a big deal of it. "When I was young, I studied music for a while," she said. "But I stopped. Life had other plans." They wanted to ask more, but something in her eyes stopped them. There was kindness there, but also pain, a story she wasn't ready to tell. The teachers thanked her again and again. She smiled politely, picked up her cleaning tools, and left the room quietly. As she walked down the hall, she could still hear the faint echo of the piano behind her. For some reason, her heart felt both heavy and light. That song had awakened something she thought was gone forever. That evening, when she reached home, she sat by the small window in her tiny apartment. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. She made herself a cup of tea and sat quietly thinking. Her fingers still tingled from the piano keys. For the first time in years, she felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. She looked around her room, simple, quiet, almost empty except for a few books and an old photograph. It showed her as a young woman standing beside a grand piano smiling brightly. She hadn't looked at that picture in a long time. Slowly, she picked it up and smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd play again," she whispered to herself. The next morning, she returned to work as usual, expecting everything to go back to normal. But the teachers had something else in mind. They had been talking, and an idea had formed among them. That afternoon, the head of the music department approached her with a kind smile. "We're planning something special," he said. "We'd love for you to play at the school ceremony next week. You wouldn't have to do it alone. We'll handle everything. But it would mean a lot to the students and to us." Her eyes widened. "Play at the ceremony?" "Oh no, I can't. That's not for me," he smiled gently. "It's not about showing off. It's about sharing what you have. What you did yesterday touched all of us. The students could learn so much from you, not just about music but about heart." She didn't answer right away. The idea frightened her, but it also stirred something inside. She had spent so many years hiding her gift, afraid to revisit the life she had left behind. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. That night, she sat by her window again, thinking about the invitation. She imagined standing in front of the crowd, her hands on the keys, the melody flowing once more. For years, she had thought her story was over. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe the music still had one more chapter to write. And as the moonlight spilled across the floor, she whispered to herself, "Maybe. I'll try." The next few days passed quietly, but something had changed in the way the woman walked through the halls. She still wore the same uniform, carried the same cleaning tools, and moved with the same calmness. But there was a light in her eyes now. It wasn't loud or proud, just a quiet spark, like someone who had remembered something important after a long time. The music teachers greeted her warmly each morning, and a few students began smiling at her as they passed. Some whispered to each other. Others simply nodded respectfully. She didn't know that most of the school already knew about her secret. The story of the janitor who played like a concert pianist had spread faster than she could imagine. One morning, the head music teacher stopped her in the hallway. He carried a folder under his arm and said gently, "We were serious about what we asked before. We'd really love for you to play at the ceremony next week. It's a small piece, nothing too fancy. You'd be amazing." She looked nervous, almost startled. "Oh, I don't know," she said softly. "I haven't played in front of people for a very long time." "I don't think I could," he smiled kindly. "You already did. You played for us, remember? And you left us speechless." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "That was different. There were only a few of you. The whole school is another story." The teacher nodded with understanding. "I get it. But if you change your mind, the invitation is open. We'd be honored." After he left, she stood there for a while, thinking. She could still feel the weight of the piano keys under her fingers from that day. Part of her wanted to say yes, but another part, the one that had been silent for so many years, was afraid. She had spent so much of her life away from the stage that she didn't know if she belonged there anymore. That night she couldn't sleep. The thought of playing again in front of an audience kept returning to her mind. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering her younger days. Practice sessions that went on until midnight. The smell of polished wood in the concert halls. The way the spotlight felt warm on her hands. It was a different life, one filled with hope and sound and applause. But it all had ended suddenly when life took her in another direction. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years she whispered a small prayer to herself. Not for success, not for fame, but for courage. The next morning, she went to the auditorium early before anyone else arrived. The sunlight poured through the high windows, painting soft golden lines across the stage. The piano sat in the center, silent but waiting. She walked toward it slowly, her shoes echoing on the wooden floor. Then she sat down and touched the keys. They felt cool and smooth under her fingers. For a long moment she didn't play anything. She just sat there breathing, listening to the quiet. Then she began to play softly. The sound rose gently in the empty hall, wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. It wasn't perfect, her fingers stumbled once or twice, but it was beautiful. She closed her eyes and let her hands move on their own, as if the piano were guiding her. Each note carried something from her heart, something she couldn't express in words. When she finished, the silence that followed felt peaceful, not lonely. She realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She would play, not for recognition or applause, but simply because music was still part of who she was. Later that day, she went to the music office and gently knocked on the door. The teacher looked up from his desk and smiled when he saw her. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "If you still want me to play at the ceremony, I'll do it." The teacher's face lit up. "Really? That's wonderful. You'll make the evening unforgettable." She smiled nervously. "I don't know about that, but I'll do my best." From that moment, things began to change quickly. Every evening after school, when the students had gone home, she stayed behind to practice. The teachers gave her access to the music room, and sometimes one of them would stay late just to listen or to help turn the pages for her. At first, her hands were stiff. Years of work and cleaning had made her fingers rough, and they didn't move as easily as they once did. But day by day, she improved. The sound grew richer, her timing sharper, her expression deeper. It wasn't just practice, it was rediscovery. Sometimes, while she played, a few students would quietly peek through the door. They didn't interrupt. They just stood there listening, wide-eyed. Word spread even more. The janitor, who once seemed invisible, had become the quiet star of the school. One evening, after finishing a long session, she sat on the piano bench and looked down at her hands. They were tired, but she smiled anyway. The music had returned to her like an old friend who had never truly left. A soft voice came from behind her. "You play beautifully," said a student who had stayed behind after choir practice. She turned, surprised. The boy looked nervous. "Sorry, I didn't mean to listen in," he said quickly. "It's just, I've never heard anyone play like that before." She smiled warmly. "Thank you. Do you play the piano too?" He nodded shyly. "A little, but I get nervous when people watch." She chuckled softly. "So do I," she said. "Even after all these years." The boy laughed a little, surprised. "You, nervous? But you're amazing." She looked at the piano, then back at him. "It doesn't matter how long you've played. The nerves never go away. But if you love music, you learn to play through them. That's what matters." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "Will you really play at the ceremony?" "Yes," she said. "I think it's time." When the boy left, she sat there for a while longer, smiling quietly to herself. It felt strange and wonderful to inspire someone again. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed that feeling. As the week went on, anticipation grew. The school buzzed with talk of the upcoming ceremony. Teachers were setting up decorations. Students were rehearsing songs, and everyone seemed excited. But the most whispered question in the halls was the same. Is it true she's really going to play? She tried to ignore the attention. She kept her focus on the music. Every note she practiced felt like a step closer to healing something deep inside her. Sometimes she would pause, close her eyes, and let a tear fall quietly before continuing. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was the weight of years finally being lifted. One afternoon, while she practiced, one of the teachers walked up to her after she finished and said, "Do you realize what's happening here? You've inspired the whole school. The students are talking about you like you're part of a miracle." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm just doing what I love. Nothing more." "That's exactly why it's special," the teacher said. The day before the ceremony, she stayed after hours again. The auditorium was empty, the chairs neatly lined up, the lights dim. She sat at the piano one last time, her reflection faintly visible in the shiny black surface. She started playing quietly, each note soft and deliberate. The melody filled the room, echoing gently against the walls. When she reached the end, she sat still for a long time. Her heart was calm now. There was no fear left, only peace. She whispered to herself, "Tomorrow I'll play like it's the last song I'll ever share." The next morning she woke early. The air outside was cool, the sky pale blue. As she dressed and tied her hair neatly, she looked in the mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't just see a janitor. She saw a woman who had lived, lost, and found her way back to what she loved most. She took a deep breath and smiled gently. Tomorrow would be her day, not for fame or glory, but for truth. Music was her language, and finally, after so many silent years, she was ready to speak again. The day of the ceremony finally arrived. The morning sun cast a soft golden light over the school building. and there was a quiet excitement in the air. Teachers were moving around, making last-minute arrangements. Students were helping set up chairs, and laughter echoed through the hallways. But behind all the noise, she felt her own calm heartbeat. Steady, nervous but peaceful. She had come earlier than usual, wearing her cleanest clothes. They weren't fancy, but they were neat, pressed, and simple. Just like her. She went straight to the auditorium, where the sound crew was testing the microphones and the music teachers were tuning instruments. The piano sat in the middle of the stage, shining under the soft lights. She looked at it and took a quiet breath. This time she didn't look away. She walked up to it and gently touched the edge of the instrument, her fingers brushing over the polished surface like greeting an old friend. One of the teachers noticed her and smiled warmly. "Good morning. You're early. Are you ready for tonight?" She smiled faintly. "As ready as I'll ever be. You'll be wonderful," the teacher said with confidence. "You have no idea how much everyone is looking forward to this." She nodded quietly. Deep down, she wasn't worried about the performance anymore. What she felt instead was something different, like a door opening inside her after being closed for many years. Throughout the day, the school was buzzing with excitement. Word had spread far beyond the staff. Parents had heard, former students were talking about it, and the principal even mentioned it in the morning announcement. Tonight's ceremony will feature a very special performance that none of you will forget. She stayed out of the spotlight as much as she could, helping with decorations and offering a hand wherever needed. She didn't like attention, and she didn't want anyone to treat her differently. But even as she swept the floor or moved boxes, people stopped her in the hallway just to say kind things. "I heard you play so beautifully," said a student shyly. "My mom's coming just to hear you," said another. Each compliment made her blush and smile. It felt strange, but it also made her heart full. As the hours passed, the school transformed. The stage was decorated with soft lights, flowers, and banners. Rows of chairs filled the auditorium, and the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. When evening came, she stood quietly backstage, listening to the audience settle. The ceremony began with speeches, awards, and student performances. The atmosphere was warm and joyful. She peeked through the curtain and saw the crowd, students, teachers, families, all smiling and clapping. Her heart beat faster. She knew her turn was coming soon. One of the teachers came backstage and whispered kindly, "You're next." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "All right." As the teacher walked away, she closed her eyes for a moment. She could hear the faint applause from the last performance fading. She whispered softly to herself, "This isn't about me. It's about the music. Let it speak." The lights dimmed and the announcer's voice filled the hall. "And now we have a very special moment. Tonight, we will hear a performance from someone many of us see every day, but never truly knew. Please welcome the heart of our school, the woman who keeps these halls shining, and who, as it turns out, has a gift beyond words." There was a gentle murmur in the crowd, a mix of curiosity and surprise. She stepped onto the stage slowly. The lights were bright, and for a moment she had to squint. She could see so many faces, familiar ones, smiling ones, expectant ones. Her steps were soft but steady as she approached the piano. The applause that rose from the crowd was warm, full of respect, not noise. She bowed her head slightly, her eyes glistening, then sat down at the piano bench. The room fell silent. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. Then she took a breath and began to play. The first note echoed through the hall like a drop of water falling into still water. Then another. Then the melody began to bloom, gentle, full, and rich with emotion. Her fingers moved gracefully, every note clear and alive. The crowd sat perfectly still. The music carried something beyond technique. It was honesty. It spoke of youth, loss, and love. It spoke of quiet strength, of time passing, and of hope that never really dies. Some people in the audience closed their eyes. Others watched with tears forming in their eyes. The music swelled and softened, filling every corner of the hall. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was tender, like a whisper from the heart that everyone could understand. When she reached the final part, the notes grew slower, deeper, until the last sound faded into silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the applause came, not a burst but a wave, growing louder and louder until the entire room was standing. She looked up, stunned. The teachers, the students, even the principal were on their feet, clapping and cheering. Some wiped their eyes. She smiled shyly, tears shining in her own eyes. The teacher who had first encouraged her stepped forward and gently took the microphone. "There's something all of you should know," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "What you just heard was not luck or chance. Years ago, before she ever came here, she was a trained pianist. She studied music abroad. She performed in competitions, in theaters, and then one day she gave it all up to care for someone she loved. Life changed and she never returned to the stage. Until tonight." A quiet gasp rippled through the room. People turned to look at her, surprised and deeply moved. She stood there, unsure of what to say. The teacher handed her the microphone gently. "Would you like to tell them your story?" For a moment she hesitated. She had never liked talking about herself. But then she looked at the sea of faces before her. Young students, curious eyes, warm smiles. Something in her heart told her that maybe it was time. She took the microphone softly and spoke, her voice calm but full of feeling. "When I was young," she began, "I dreamed of becoming a pianist. I practiced every day, sometimes until my fingers hurt. I studied in places far from home. I wanted to play for the world, but life doesn't always go the way we plan." She paused for a moment, her eyes glistening. "Someone I loved fell very ill and I had to make a choice. I left the stage to take care of him. I thought I'd return someday, but time passed and the world moved on. I started working, different jobs, simple ones. But the piano, it never left my heart. Every time I saw one, I felt it calling me. The room was completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. I thought that part of my life was over," she continued softly. "But then a few kind teachers here asked me to play again. And somehow that little moment reminded me that music doesn't belong to a stage. It belongs to the heart. You don't need fame or applause to make it real. You just need love for what you do." Her voice trembled slightly as she finished. "So if any of you have something you love, something that makes you feel alive, don't let it go. Even if life takes you far away from it, keep it inside you. Because one day when you least expect it, it might come back and make you whole again." The crowd rose again, clapping, cheering, some with tears streaming down their faces. It wasn't just applause for her performance anymore. It was gratitude for her honesty, her courage, and her story. The principal came on stage, shaking her hand warmly. "You've reminded us all what true talent looks like. It's not in the spotlight. It's in the heart." She smiled, tears gently rolling down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, when the ceremony ended, people lined up to thank her. Students told her she had inspired them. Parents said her story gave them hope. Teachers hugged her, proud and moved. When the hall finally emptied, she stayed behind for a few minutes. The lights were dim, the chairs empty again. She walked to the piano one more time and placed her hand on it. "Thank you," she whispered to it, smiling softly. As she turned to leave, she didn't feel like the same woman who had started this journey. She wasn't invisible anymore. But more importantly, she wasn't hiding from herself anymore. For the first time in many years, she walked out of the auditorium with her head held high, not as a janitor, not as a performer, but as a woman who had found her music again. And outside, under the cool night sky, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time: peace. The next morning, the school felt different. The sun was shining brighter than usual, and the corridors seemed to carry an unusual kind of excitement. People were talking, smiling, and whispering to one another about the performance from the night before. Teachers who usually passed by her with quick greetings now stopped to thank her. Students smiled shyly, some even waved as she walked by. One girl handed her a small note that read, "You made me believe I can follow my dream again." She kept that note carefully folded in her pocket for the rest of the day. She didn't crave attention or praise, but the kindness she received touched her deeply. For so many years she had walked these same halls unnoticed, someone people passed by but never really saw. Now they looked at her differently, not because she had played the piano beautifully, but because they had finally seen who she truly was. Later that day, the principal called her into his office. She went in quietly, wondering if something was wrong. But when she stepped inside, he stood up from behind his desk with a warm smile and said, "Please have a seat." She sat down slowly, her hands folded on her lap. "I just wanted to thank you again for last night," he said. "You reminded everyone of something important, that every person here has a story. You've inspired the students and the teachers alike. She smiled softly. I'm glad it meant something to them. It meant everything, he said. We've been receiving calls all morning from parents saying how moved they were. Some even asked if you would perform again. Her eyes widened slightly. Perform again? He nodded, smiling. Yes, we're organizing a small community evening in a few weeks. It'll be open to everyone in town. If you're comfortable, we'd love for you to be part of it. She hesitated, her heart racing a little. The thought of performing again scared her. But there was also a tiny spark inside her that she hadn't felt in years. Something that told her maybe it was time to share her music. Again. I'll think about it, she said, with a small smile. That's all I ask, the principal replied kindly. That evening, she walked home feeling lighter. The streets were quiet. The sky was painted in soft orange and purple shades, and she carried a small paper bag with groceries in her hand. As she passed the bakery, the owner waved from inside. I saw your performance, he called out cheerfully. You were wonderful. She blushed and waved back, smiling shyly. At home, she made tea and sat by the window, looking out at the trees swaying gently in the wind. Her tiny apartment was simple. A small table, a few chairs, and a photograph of her late husband on the shelf. She picked it up and smiled softly. You would have laughed seeing me on stage again, she whispered. I could almost hear your voice cheering me on. Her husband had always loved hearing her play. Even in his final years, when he was too weak to speak much, he would close his eyes and smile whenever she touched the piano keys. Remembering that brought tears to her eyes, but they were not of pain anymore. They were warm, full of love. The next few days went by quietly, but something inside her had changed. After work, she began visiting the old community center on her way home. There was an old piano in one of the empty rooms, slightly out of tune but still full of life. She asked the caretaker if she could use it sometimes. He looked surprised but said kindly, Of course. It's been sitting there for years. You'll be doing it a favor. And so every evening after finishing her duties, she would stop by the center, open the lid of that worn piano, and let her fingers dance across the keys. Sometimes she played softly, just for herself. Other times, a few people passing by would stop and listen through the open door. One evening, a young boy peeked inside shyly. Can I listen?
He asked. She smiled and nodded.
Of course. He sat quietly on a bench as she played. When she finished, he clapped his small hands together and said, That was beautiful. My mom says music helps the heart feel better. She smiled gently. She's right. The boy's visits became regular. Sometimes he brought his little sister too. They'd sit quietly, swinging their legs, listening to her play. The simple joy in their faces reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. How music could bring people together without needing words. One day, the music teacher from her school stopped by unexpectedly. So this is where you've been hiding, he said with a smile. She laughed softly. Not hiding, just playing. I came to tell you, he said, sitting down on a nearby chair, that the community concert is now official. People are already signing up. It's going to be big, and everyone wants you to close the evening with a performance. She looked down at the keys, feeling that familiar flutter of nervousness. I don't know if I can handle something like that again. He leaned forward gently. You already did once, and look what it did. It brought life back to this place. Don't think of it as performing. Think of it as sharing. She looked up at him and smiled. Sharing, she repeated quietly. That night she made her decision. She would do it, not for recognition or applause, but because she wanted to give something back to the people who had shown her kindness when she least expected it. The following weeks were filled with quiet preparation. After work, she'd head to the community center and practice. Word spread quickly, and soon small groups began to gather in the evenings just to listen. Parents brought their children. Elderly neighbors came with cups of tea. The room that had once been empty was now filled with warmth and laughter. One evening, as she played a soft melody, she noticed an old woman sitting in the back, eyes closed, tears rolling down her cheeks. When the music ended, the woman came forward and said, That piece. My husband used to love that. You brought him back to me for a moment. She took the woman's hands gently and smiled. Music remembers what words forget, she said softly. The woman nodded, holding her hands tightly. Day by day, she began to see how her simple act of playing had turned into something much bigger. It wasn't about talent or skill anymore. It was about connection. About hearts being healed, people being reminded of beauty, and hope finding its way back into quiet lives. When the evening of the community concert arrived, the entire town seemed to come alive. The school auditorium was decorated again, this time even more beautifully. The stage lights glowed softly and the seats filled quickly. Backstage, she stood quietly, her hands clasped together. The same teacher who had first encouraged her came up beside her. "Nervous?" he asked gently. "A little," she admitted with a smile. "But it feels different this time," he nodded. "Because now you're not playing to prove anything. You're playing to give." She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The audience erupted into applause before she even touched the piano. But as she sat down and placed her fingers on the keys, the room grew still. This time she played a song she had written herself. It was a melody she had composed many years ago but never performed for anyone. It was gentle, full of warmth, like a letter to the past and a gift to the present. The music flowed through the hall, and the audience sat in complete silence, listening to every note. Some smiled, some cried quietly, but everyone felt it. The peace, the love, the story in her sound. When she finished, the entire hall rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. But she didn't bow. She simply smiled. Her hands resting on the piano, tears glistening in her eyes. The teacher walked on stage and whispered, "You did it again." She shook her head softly. "No," she said, looking out at the crowd, "we did." That night, after the lights dimmed and everyone left, she stayed back for a while, alone with the piano. The moonlight shone through the windows and the soft scent of flowers lingered in the air. She played one last quiet tune, a song just for herself, a song of gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt complete, not because people had cheered, but because she had finally found her place again. Music was not behind her anymore. It was with her, living quietly in her heart. As she walked home that night under the stars, she didn't look back at the hall. She didn't need to. She carried the sound with her, a sound that no longer belonged to the past but to the life she had found again. The morning after the concert felt quiet and peaceful. The world outside seemed slower, as if it too was taking a deep breath after the beautiful night before. The sky was pale blue, the air cool and calm. She sat by her small window, sipping her tea, still smiling softly to herself. The applause from the concert still echoed faintly in her mind, not as noise but as a warm memory. She wasn't thinking about the praise or attention. It was the faces she remembered most. The faces of people smiling, crying, feeling something together. That was what mattered to her. When she arrived at school that morning, something unexpected happened. The students were waiting near the gates, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. They cheered softly as she walked in. One of the younger students stepped forward and said, "This is for you. Thank you for your music." She took the flowers gently, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You all made that night special for me too." As the day went on, she noticed how different the school felt now. The atmosphere was lighter, warmer. Music could be heard coming from classrooms during breaks. Students practicing on guitars, recorders, even small keyboards. It was as if her performance had reminded everyone of how much joy music could bring. Later that week, the principal invited her into his office once again. This time there was a small envelope waiting on his desk. "I wanted to tell you something wonderful," he said, smiling. "The school board has decided to start a new after-school program. Free piano lessons for students who want to learn. And we were hoping you would consider teaching it." She froze, her eyes widening in surprise. "Me?" "Yes, you," he said gently. "No one could do it better. You've shown these children what passion really looks like. We'll pay you for your time, of course, but more than that, we believe your story will inspire them." She sat quietly for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. For so long she had worked in silence, never imagining that one day she'd be asked to teach something that had once been her entire world. "I don't know if I'm a teacher," she said softly. He smiled. "You already are. You just don't know it yet." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about it. The idea of teaching children how to play, helping them find the same peace she had found in music. Her heart felt full, but she was also nervous. What if she wasn't good enough anymore? What if she didn't have the patience or the skill to guide them? But the next morning, as she walked past the music room, she saw a group of students gathered around the piano, trying to figure out a melody together. They were laughing, helping one another, their fingers stumbling across the keys. She smiled quietly. Maybe she could help them after all. A week later, the new piano program officially began. The first day, only 3 students showed up. They were shy and uncertain, just like she had been when she sat at a piano for the first time as a little girl. She greeted them warmly. "We'll start simple," she said with a smile. "The piano isn't about speed or skill. It's about listening not just to the notes, but to your heart." The students nodded eagerly, and soon the room filled with the soft sound of hesitant keys and quiet laughter. Days turned into weeks, and the class grew. More students joined, then more after that. Before long, the small room couldn't hold them all. Parents came to watch. The sound of music filled the halls again, just like it used to when she was young. She found herself smiling more often. She laughed with the children, corrected their mistakes gently, and told them stories from her own life. Not the sad parts, but the beautiful lessons she had learned from them. One evening, after a long day of teaching, she sat alone at the piano as the sun set through the windows. The golden light fell on the keys and she played a soft tune, something new, something she had composed in her heart without even realizing it. It was a song of peace, of gratitude, of finding one's way home. As the last note faded, she heard soft clapping behind her. She turned to see the principal standing at the door. "Still playing after hours?" he said gently. She smiled. "I guess I can't stop now." He walked in, his hands in his pockets. "You've changed this place, you know. You've changed more lives than you realize." She looked down, embarrassed. "I just played the piano." He shook his head. "No. You reminded us all that beauty doesn't disappear even when we forget it for a while. It just waits for the right moment and the right person to bring it back." Her eyes filled with quiet tears and she looked away, smiling softly. "Thank you," she whispered. Over time, her story spread beyond the school. Local newspapers wrote small articles about the mystery pianist who once worked as a cleaner and now taught children music. Some people came to see her classes just to meet her, to hear her play. She was humble as ever, never trying to be famous. But fame, in a quiet way, found her. One day, a young journalist asked if she could interview her. At first she hesitated, but eventually agreed. They sat together in the small community center where it had all begun. When the journalist asked, "What do you think is the most important thing music has taught you?" She paused for a long moment before answering. "Music taught me patience," she said softly. "It taught me that silence is as important as sound. It taught me that even when life goes quiet, it doesn't mean it's over. It just means you're waiting for the next note." Her words touched many who read them. People began writing letters to her, strangers from other towns, even from far away, sharing how her story had inspired them to pick up their instruments again, to start painting, to sing, to create, to try. She never thought of herself as someone special, but somehow, her quiet journey had rippled outward and touched more hearts than she ever imagined. Years passed gently. The students she had once taught grew older, some moving on to college, some starting families of their own. Many of them still visited her, bringing their children to meet the woman who had taught them their first song. She grew older, too, her hair turning silver, her hands a little slower on the keys. But her eyes still sparkled whenever she sat at the piano. Every time she touched the keys, it felt like coming home. One cool autumn morning, she unlocked the school's music room as she always did. The sunlight streamed through the window and dust particles danced in the light. She sat down at the piano and smiled. As she began to play, she realized she wasn't thinking about the past anymore, not about the years she had lost, the stages she never returned to, or the applause that faded long ago. She was thinking only of the present, of the children's laughter echoing down the hall, of the sound of birds outside, of the music filling her heart, and for the first time in her life, she understood something deeply. She had always believed she gave up her dream when she left the stage years ago. But now she saw that she hadn't lost it at all. It had simply changed shape. Her dream had found a new way to live, not through fame or crowds, but through the hundreds of small hearts she had touched along the way. Later that afternoon, she closed the piano lid gently and stood by the window, Looking out at the playground filled with laughing children, a soft wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint sound of music from one of the classrooms where her students were practicing. She smiled to herself, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek. The world outside had moved on, but inside that small school her music lived on. In every child who learned a note, in every melody that echoed down the hallway, in every heart that found courage through her story, and somewhere in that soft, endless music, her husband's memory, her younger self's dreams, and her present peace all lived together, timeless, gentle, whole. As the sun began to set, she whispered softly, "Thank you." She didn't know who she was thanking, but perhaps life itself, for leading her in such a long, winding, beautiful way back to where she truly belonged. That night, as she locked the doors and walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, she didn't feel tired or lonely. She felt alive, because even in silence her music continued, not in her hands anymore but in the hearts she had touched forever.